essentially, peak velocity in a power clean is most likely to occur during the second pull phase. And that's when you achieve sort of maximal barbell height. So that can be really useful for information pertaining to an individual's like explosive strength and their technical execution of a lift. And whereas mean velocity in the power clean is, obviously it's the average velocity from the start to the end of the lift, but the time spent, like in terms of the velocity during the movement, is largely determined from the first pull phase and the transition phase of the power clean. So they tell you slightly different stories. So mean velocity itself is based off the data that I've sort of done in the lab, and a collaboration with a colleague of mine, Stephen Thompson, over at Sheffield Hallam Uni. Essentially what Steve established was mean velocity was slightly more reliable than peak velocity. And having said that, you can still use one or the other, like there's no issue there. But basically answering your question in terms of speed chart for Olympic lifts, yes, it does exist. And I sort of put together some guidelines on that. And I've sort of developed it from the collaboration with Steve and then also with Paul Comfort and Tim Suchamel's Olympic lifting work as well. But so if you want to use mean velocity, starting strength, which is, Brian has from 10 to 25% of 1RM roughly, any speed, and this is all to do with mean velocity, and now I'll talk about peak velocity, speeds over 1.6 meters per second would be classified as your starting strength in the power clean. For speed strength, which is sort of roughly categorized between 25% and 45% 1RM, mean velocity is between 1.6 and 1.4. Strength speed, so between 45 and 65% 1RM, is 1.4 meters per second to 1.25 meters per second. Accelerative strength, which is 65% 1RM to 80% 1RM, is velocities of 1.25 meters per second to 1.1. And then absolute strength, so loads above 80% 1RM, any speeds around 1.1 meters per second or below. Now, what's really important to understand with velocity zones with Olympic lifts is the velocities are much tighter because there's an all or nothing sort of principle with power cleans where you have to hit, like they're very quick movements, and you have to hit a certain velocity, in mean velocity of 1.1 or 1 meter per second, or you basically won't complete the lift. So the gradient, the inverse relationship between load and velocity is much shallower, much flatter, much more horizontal compared to core foundation lifts. So the velocity zones are far different for Olympic lifts comparative to the core foundation lifts. So that was mean velocity. I can send you this data if you want, and you can create a velocity zone you can whack on the website. But for peak velocity, again, still developed from the work of Steve and Paul and Tim, and sort of amalgamated it together. And then I've done some stuff in the lab myself where I've tried to look at my own profile and students' profiles. So with peak velocity, with the velocity zones with starting strength, so 10 to 25% 1RM, speeds or velocities above 2.6 meters per second, with speed strength, so that's 25 to 45% 1RM, peak velocities of 2.6 to 2.4 meters per second, with strength speed, which is 45% to 65% 1RM, you're looking at peak velocities of 2.4 to 2.2 meters per second. with accelerative strength. So Brian's classified as sort of 65% to 80%. You've got 2.2 to 2 meters per second. And then absolute strength in the power clean using peak velocity is any speed or any velocity rather, peak velocity below 2 meters per second. So they're your rough velocity zones from what I've come across in the literature for the power clean in mean velocity and using peak velocity. So what you'll establish from those is those zones and those sort of categories, if you like, are much tighter. We're sort of talking 25% tighter in each zone compared to the core foundation lifts. So those zones that I was discussing just then, that is sort of your generalized zones. If you wanted to have specific zones to a particular, so say you're coaching an Olympic athlete, you'd want pretty precise zones and data. So you would do a low velocity profile in the exercise for that individual. But say you're a rugby team or an American football team, you probably don't have the time to create individualized profiles. So someone like Brian, who's at University of Miami, or even when he was at Missouri, they've got 50 athletes. Like, I'm not individualised. One exercise velocity zones per individual, and some of those guys probably don't even make the team. So, you got to think about time efficiency. So that's where the generalised velocity zones are really good and useful for coaches with large groups of athletes. With the power clean, there is a bit of variability in terms of between individuals. Some guys are really quick. Even at 1RM, some guys are, lifting mean velocities of 1.2 meters per second, whereas, some other guys are lifting, 0.9. So there is still quite a lot of between subject variation. But those guidelines I gave before are a pretty good indicator of the general zones, which is, I guess, what you guys are after.